The grand chamber of the Galactic Council stretched high above the polished floor where Ambassador Jack Morrison stood waiting for his turn to speak. The massive dome above him showed the stars of 1,000 worlds, each one representing a civilization that had joined the Council over the centuries. 73 years ago, humanity had walked through these doors with hope in their hearts and dreams of partnership in their minds. Today, Jack was about to end that dream forever. Around him sat the representatives of 12 alien species, each one arranged on elevated platforms that rose in tiers like an ancient amphitheater. The Vraxians occupied the highest position, their scaled bodies gleaming under the artificial light. Their leader, High Chancellor Vexler, looked down at Jack with barely concealed boredom. To his left sat the insectoid Keltharians, clicking their mandibles in quiet conversation. The Zephrons floated in their containment spheres, their gaseous forms swirling with colors that reflected their emotions. Each species had their place in the hierarchy. Humanity had always been at the bottom. Jack took a deep breath and activated his presentation. Holographic displays materialized in the air, showing data that his team had spent months compiling. The images showed human colonies in the Outer Rim territories, settlements that Earth had built with their own resources and their own sweat. The data told a story of systematic exclusion from trade agreements, of denied requests for defense support, of applications for expansion rights that were rejected without explanation. He began to speak, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. He explained how human merchants were charged triple the docking fees at council stations. He showed evidence of how human scientific discoveries were credited to other species in official records. He presented testimony from human families whose requests for asylum assistance were ignored while other species received immediate help. For 20 minutes, he laid out a pattern of discrimination that had gone on for decades. The council members listened with expressions ranging from indifference to annoyance. When Jack finished, High Chancellor Vexler leaned forward on his platform. His voice echoed through the chamber with the authority of someone who had never been seriously challenged. He dismissed the complaints as misunderstandings and growing pains. He reminded Jack that humanity was still relatively new to galactic politics. He suggested that perhaps humans were too sensitive, too quick to see insults where none were intended. Jack had expected this response. He had heard variations of it for years. He pulled up another hologram, this one showing the proposal for Security Directorate membership that Earth had submitted. It was humanity's 5th attempt to gain a seat on the Directorate, the body that made decisions about military protection and crisis response. The proposal was comprehensive, well-researched, and backed by testimonials from species that humanity had helped in times of crisis. The vote was called. One by one, the council members registered their decisions. The result was the same as it had been 4 times before. Humanity was denied membership. The official reason given was lack of experience, though several species with far less experience held seats on the Directorate. The real reason, Jack knew, was that the established powers did not want to share their authority with upstart humans who asked too many questions and pushed too hard for change. Jack. Morrison stood in silence for a long moment. Around the chamber, the alien delegates were already turning their attention to other matters. They had rendered their judgment, and in their minds the matter was settled. Humanity would accept the decision as they always had. The humans would complain for a while, then get back to work, maintaining the systems that kept the galaxy running. Everything would continue as it always had. But Jack had not come here today to accept another rejection. He had come to deliver a message that would change the galaxy forever. He cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the chamber with unexpected force. The delegates turned back to him with expressions of surprise. Usually, ambassadors simply left after receiving bad news. Jack spoke clearly and calmly. He thanked the council for their time and consideration. Then he informed them that the government of Earth and all human colonies had reached a unanimous decision. Effective immediately, humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Council. All human personnel would be recalled from council operations. All human resources and technology would be removed from council control. All agreements and treaties signed under council authority would be terminated. The chamber erupted in noise. Delegates from a dozen species began talking at once, their voices and sounds creating a cacophony that bounced off the domed ceiling. High Chancellor Wexler raised his hand for silence, and gradually the noise subsided. He looked at Jack with an expression that might have been amusement on a human face. He told Jack that this was an emotional response to a difficult situation. He suggested that Jack take some time to reconsider. He warned that humanity would regret this decision within months. Jack smiled, and there was no warmth in it. He told the Chancellor that humanity had already considered all the consequences. He explained that Earth would be focusing its efforts on building partnerships with species who valued mutual respect. He made it clear that any civilization wishing to engage with humanity as equals would be welcomed with open arms. Then he turned and walked toward the massive doors at the chamber entrance. Behind him, the alien delegates began to laugh. The sound started with the Varaxians and spread through the chamber like a wave. They were certain that this was a bluff, a negotiating tactic meant to extract concessions. They believed that humanity would come crawling back within weeks, desperate to rejoin the galactic community. After all, what could humans possibly offer on their own? They were a young species with limited territory and modest resources. As Jack walked through the doors, he heard High Chancellor Wexler call out a final comment. The Chancellor said that the Council would graciously accept humanity's return when they came to their senses. The chamber filled with laughter again. Jack did not turn around. He kept walking, his footsteps echoing in the long corridor beyond. On the other side of the galaxy, Captain Ryan Hayes received a priority transmission aboard the Earth vessel Horizon's Edge. His ship was one of 47 human vessels spread across the Council territories, each one assigned to critical infrastructure duties. Ryan commanded a crew of 200 men and women who had spent years maintaining the Epsilon Gate, one of the largest jump gates in the network. The message was brief and carried the seal of Earth's unified government. It contained a single order: begin withdrawal protocols immediately. All human personnel were to return to Earth-controlled space within 30 days. All technology and equipment installed by human engineers was to be removed or rendered inoperable. The message ended with a quote that had become famous in human history: "We will not beg for scraps at a table, or we built the chairs." Ryan read the message 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. Then he called his senior officers to the bridge. His first officer, a woman named Kate Sullivan, who had served with him for 8 years, arrived first. She read the orders on his screen and let out a low whistle. She asked if Earth had finally grown a spine. Ryan nodded and told her to prepare the crew. They had a lot of work to do, and only 30 days to do it, as news of humanity's withdrawal spread through the galactic communication network. Reactions varied widely. Some species expressed shock. A few expressed regret. Most expressed indifference or dismissal. The general consensus among the established powers was that humanity had made a childish mistake that would soon be corrected. None of them understood what was about to happen. None of them realized that they had just lost the species that held their entire civilization together. 3 weeks had passed since. Ambassador Jack Morrison walked out of the Galactic Council chambers, and the first signs of trouble were beginning to appear across the galaxy. On the engineering deck of Gate Station Epsilon 7, a Varaxian technician named Kreth stared at a display panel that was showing readings he did not understand. The numbers were fluctuating in patterns that made no sense according to his training. He had been assigned to take over the maintenance duties that the human engineering team had performed for the past 12 years. Kreth pressed several buttons, trying to stabilize the power flow through the gate's primary conduits. The fluctuations only grew worse. He consulted the technical manual that the humans had left behind, but the document was filled with notes and annotations that referenced concepts he had never studied. There were mentions of harmonic stabilization protocols and quantum field adjustments that were not part of standard gate maintenance procedures. He realized with growing concern that the humans had been doing something far more complex than anyone had understood, halfway across the galaxy. On the trade world of Pelos 4, Merchant Captain Kevin Drake stood in his small apartment watching the news broadcasts with a mixture of concern and vindication. Kevin was one of the few humans who had chosen to stay in council space after the withdrawal. Having married a Polarian woman and built a life far from Earth, the news showed riots. Breaking out in the central marketplace where he had worked for 15 years, the reporter explained that a trade dispute between Keltharian silk merchants and Vraxian textile buyers had escalated into violence. For decades, human traders had served as intermediaries between species that refused to deal with each other directly. Ancient grudges and cultural differences made direct negotiations nearly impossible. Kevin had personally brokered thousands of deals between species who would not even sit in the same room together. Now, with humans gone, those old hatreds were bubbling to the surface. Kevin's communication device chimed with incoming messages. His Polarian business partners were panicking. Without human mediators, their supply chains were breaking down. Shipments were being refused at docking stations. Contracts were being disputed with no neutral party to arbitrate. The entire economic system that had functioned smoothly for decades was beginning to fracture along species lines. In the military headquarters of the Zephron Collective, Commander Vexari floated in his containment sphere, studying the holographic display that showed their early warning defense network. Red alerts were flashing across 40 different systems. His analysts were reporting potential enemy movements in sectors that should have been completely secure. Attack fleets were apparently massing near their borders. Invasion forces were supposedly preparing to strike at civilian populations. Vexari knew something was wrong. The intelligence made no sense. Their enemies did not have the resources for simultaneous attacks on 40 systems. He pulled up the technical specifications for the defense network and felt his gaseous form swirl with agitation. The system had been designed and maintained by a human strategist named Commander Amy Sullivan. She had integrated defensive networks across their entire territory, creating a complex algorithm that could distinguish real threats from false positives. The problem was that the algorithm was incredibly sophisticated. It analyzed thousands of variables, from ship movements to communication patterns to energy signatures. Amy Sullivan had spent 8 years refining the system, adjusting it based on emerging threats and changing political situations. Her team of human analysts had monitored it constantly, making micro-adjustments that kept it running smoothly. Now, with no one who truly understood how it worked, the system was producing false readings that were causing panic throughout the military command. Structure: Vexari ordered his staff to begin manual verification of every alert, but he knew this would take weeks. In the meantime, they were essentially blind to real threats. He wondered if this was what the humans had intended all along, a subtle revenge for years of dismissive treatment. Then he dismissed the thought. The humans had not caused this problem. The Council had caused it by assuming that any species could simply step in and replace human expertise. On the Council station itself, High Chancellor Vexler sat in his private chambers reviewing reports from across the galaxy. Each one brought worse news than the last. The Gate network was experiencing power failures. Trade routes were collapsing. Defense systems were malfunctioning. Medical facilities were reporting problems treating cross-species patients. Agricultural shipments were missing their destinations, and aid entered the room. Carrying a data tablet filled with emergency requests from member species, the Keltharian Empire was demanding immediate assistance with their gate maintenance. The Polarian Federation was requesting human mediators be sent back to restore order in their trade sectors. The Zephron Collective was asking if the Council could compel humanity to return Commander Sullivan to fix their defense network. Dexler read through the requests with growing frustration. He had spent the past 3 weeks insisting to anyone who would listen that the Council did not need humanity. He had claimed that the functions humans performed were simple maintenance tasks that any species could handle. He had dismissed warnings from his own analysts who tried to explain how deeply integrated humans had become in galactic infrastructure. Now reality was proving him wrong, and he was too proud to admit it publicly. He told his aide to send responses to all the requests explaining that the Council was working on solutions. He ordered additional resources be allocated to training programs for the species taking over human duties. He authorized emergency funding to hire consultants who might understand the systems the humans had built. What Dexler did not do was contact Earth. He did not apologize for the years of discrimination. He did not offer to negotiate humanity's return under better conditions. He convinced himself that this was a temporary disruption, a period of adjustment that would soon pass. The Council had existed for thousands of years before humanity joined. It would continue to exist now that they had left. Dr. Claire Bennett sat in her office at the Earth Medical Institute, reviewing reports from her former colleagues scattered across the galaxy. Claire had spent 15 years developing the medical exchange program that trained alien physicians in treating patients from different species. The biology of each race was unique, with different chemical compositions and physiological structures. Understanding how to treat a sick Vraxian without harming them required knowledge that most species only had about their own kind. The reports Claire was reading told a disturbing story. A plague had broken out on the Cordon homeworld, affecting not the native Cordons but the millions of alien visitors who came for trade and tourism. The local doctors were helpless. They could diagnose the illness easily enough, but treating it required understanding how the disease interacted with 12 different species' biologies. Claire's program had trained thousands of physicians in cross-species medicine, but most of those doctors had been human or had relied on human supervision. Claire drafted a message offering humanitarian assistance, but she knew it would not be sent. Earth's government had made it clear that they would not offer help to a council that had rejected them. If individual species wanted to request assistance through direct diplomatic channels, Earth would consider it. But the council itself would receive no aid until it was willing to treat humanity with respect. Across the galaxy, the economic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Banker Gregory Nash had created the unified currency exchange system that allowed seamless trade between species with wildly different economic structures. Some species used precious metals. Others used energy credits. A few operated on reputation-based economies that had no physical currency at all. Greg's system had translated between all of them, calculating exchange rates in real time and ensuring fair trades. Without the system, currency values were becoming chaotic. The Keltharian credit, once stable and widely accepted, had lost 30% of its value in 2 weeks. The Varaxian energy standard was fluctuating wildly as traders lost confidence in its stability. Entire planets were reverting to barter systems because they could not trust the value of their trading partner's currency. On Earth, President Sofia Martinez gave a speech to the unified human government. She stood before representatives from every human colony and settlement, her words broadcast across human space. She spoke of dignity and self-respect. She explained that humanity had tried for 7 decades to earn acceptance through hard work and goodwill. She stated clearly that they would not return to a council that saw them as servants rather than partners. The speech ended with a promise. Earth would welcome any species that wished to engage with humanity as equals. Trade agreements would be negotiated fairly. Defense pacts would be mutual. Scientific collaboration would give credit where credit was due. Humanity was not turning its back on the galaxy. It was simply refusing to accept second-class status in a community they had helped build. As the second month of humanity's withdrawal began, the Galactic Council faced a choice. They could admit their mistake and negotiate humanity's return on better terms. Or they could continue pretending that everything would eventually return to normal. High Chancellor Dexler chose pride over pragmatism, and that choice would have consequences that no one could have predicted. The Epsilon Gate explosion happened at exactly 1400 hours Galactic Standard Time, and the shockwave could be detected from 3 systems away. The massive structure that had stood for over 2 centuries suddenly tore itself apart in a cascade of energy that consumed everything within 100 kilometers. 12 ships were caught in the destruction, their crews vaporized before they even understood what was happening. The vessels represented 4 different council species, and among them were diplomats, traders, and families returning home from visits to distant relatives. The investigation team arrived within hours, led by a Vraxian engineer named Kreth, who had been trying desperately to maintain the gate network since the humans left. He floated through the debris field in a protective suit, his scanning equipment recording the devastation. What he found made his blood run cold. The gate had not failed due to age or random malfunction. It had failed because the maintenance protocols had been completely misunderstood. By the team he had trained, Kreth pulled up the maintenance logs and compared them to the procedures that engineer Lisa Chen had left behind. The difference was staggering. His team had been performing what they thought was routine maintenance, following the basic instructions in the manual. What they had not understood was that Lisa's notes contained critical warnings about harmonic frequencies and resonance patterns. The gate network was not just a collection of machines that could be serviced like any other equipment. It was a delicate system where every adjustment in one location affected the entire network. The realization hit Kreth like a physical blow. They had been treating a symphony orchestra like a collection of individual instruments. Lisa Chen had been the conductor who understood how every part worked together. Without her knowledge, they'd been making adjustments that seemed correct in isolation, but created dangerous instabilities when combined. The Epsilon Gate had been the first to fail, but Kreth knew it would not be the last. On Earth. Dr. Claire Bennett watched the news coverage of the Gate disaster with a heavy heart. She had known many of the people who died, had shared meals with them at council functions, and collaborated on research projects. The tragedy was not something she celebrated, despite the years of poor treatment humanity had endured. She immediately drafted another offer of humanitarian assistance, this time addressing it directly to the families of the victims rather than to the council itself. Claire's offer was sincere, but she also knew it served a strategic purpose. Earth's government wanted the galaxy to understand that humanity bore no ill will toward individual species or people. The problem had always been with the Council's leadership and their systematic discrimination. By offering help to those who suffered, humanity could demonstrate the difference between their approach and the Council's arrogance. The response from the Council came swiftly and was precisely what Claire had expected. High Chancellor Wexler issued a statement claiming that the disaster was under investigation and that Council experts had the situation under control. He made no mention of the human offer of assistance. He did not acknowledge that the gate had been maintained by Varaxian engineers who lacked proper training. Instead, he blamed the disaster on faulty human design and suggested that humanity bore responsibility for not providing adequate documentation. The statement was a masterpiece of political maneuvering that convinced absolutely no one who understood the technical details. Species across the galaxy began asking uncomfortable questions about what else might be failing due to the loss of human expertise. The Polarian Federation, always more pragmatic than the major powers, quietly reached out to Earth, requesting a bilateral meeting to discuss cooperation outside the Council framework. The economic situation continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. On the banking world of Nexus Prime, financial analysts watched in horror as the currency exchange system collapsed completely. Without banker Gregory Nash and his team to maintain the complex algorithms that balanced different economic systems, the markets had descended into chaos. Species that had traded freely for decades were now unable to determine fair exchange rates. A single Caltharian silk shipment that should have been worth 10,000 Varaxian energy credits was being valued anywhere from 5,000 to 50,000 depending on who was doing the calculation. Merchants were going bankrupt. Planets were running out of essential supplies because they could not afford the inflated prices. The free trade that had been a cornerstone of galactic civilization was being replaced by a confusing mess of bilateral barter agreements that benefited no one. The agricultural crisis struck next, and it hit harder than anyone had anticipated. Hannah Price had designed the crop rotation and distribution system that fed billions of non-humans across the galaxy. Her system had been elegant in its complexity, routing food from agricultural worlds to population centers while accounting for crop seasons, storage capabilities, and nutritional requirements of dozens of species. Without her oversight, the system began sending shipments to the wrong destinations. On the industrial world of Forge 7, a population of 3 million Zephrons received a massive shipment of Caltharian, grain that their gaseous bodies could not consume. Meanwhile, on the agricultural colony of New Kelthar, warehouses filled with fresh grain while the population starved because no ships arrived to transport it to markets. The mismatch was happening across hundreds of worlds, creating simultaneous surpluses and shortages that made no logical sense. Food riots broke out on 12 planets within the same week. Hungry populations blamed their governments, who blamed the council, who blamed each other. The carefully maintained peace that had existed for centuries was fraying at every edge. Ancient grudges that had been buried under prosperity were resurfaced as species. Competed for dwindling resources, the council convened an emergency session to address the cascading crises. The debate lasted for 18 hours and accomplished nothing. The Varaxian hierarchy insisted that all problems were temporary and would be resolved with proper resource allocation. The Keltharian Empire demanded that Earth be compelled to return and restore the systems they had abandoned. The Zephyron Collective suggested that the Council had been, too, dependent on a single species and should use this crisis as an opportunity to diversify. Hi, Chancellor. Dexler tried to maintain control of the session, but his authority was crumbling. Junior council members who had always deferred to the major powers were now speaking up, demanding answers and action. The Polarian representative openly stated that his government was pursuing independent talks with Earth because the Council had proven incapable of managing the situation. Other small nations began echoing his statement. On the military front, the situation was equally dire. The Zephyron Collective's defense network continued to produce false alerts that were draining their resources and creating panic among the civilian population. Commander Vexari had been forced to essentially disable an early warning system because the constant false positives were worse than having no system at all. This left 40 systems vulnerable to actual threats, a situation that neighboring powers were beginning to notice. The Korthon Empire, never a council member, but always an interested observer, began moving military assets toward the Zephyron border. They claimed it was routine exercises, but everyone understood the implications. The Zephyrons had always maintained security through their sophisticated defense network. Without it, they were exposed. The carefully balanced power structure that had prevented major wars for generations was starting to shift in dangerous ways. Back on Earth, President Sofia Martinez met with her council of advisors to discuss the developing situation. Intelligence reports showed that multiple species were reaching out through back channels, requesting assistance outside the official council framework. Some wanted technical help. Others wanted trade agreements. A few were even suggesting military alliances. The president faced a difficult decision. Earth could ignore the requests and let the council collapse completely. Or they could begin engaging with individual species and create a new galactic order built on different principles. Martinez knew that either choice would have profound consequences. She also knew that humanity's moment of maximum leverage was now. While the council was weak and desperate, she made her decision and announced it in a speech that was broadcast across human space and transmitted to every major power in the galaxy. Earth would accept diplomatic contact from any species that approached them in good faith. Trade agreements would be negotiated on terms of mutual benefit. Technical assistance would be provided to those who asked respectfully and offered fair compensation. But humanity would not return to the Galactic Council. Under its current structure, the speech ended with words that would be remembered for generations. She said that humanity had learned an important lesson during their time in the Council. Respect cannot be demanded and it cannot be bought. It can only be earned through actions and maintained through integrity. Earth was ready to build a new kind of galactic community, one based on partnership rather than hierarchy. As the third month of humanity's withdrawal came to a close, the galaxy stood at a crossroads. The old order was dying, brought down by its own arrogance and the loss of the species it had taken for granted. What would replace it remained to be seen, but everyone understood that things would never return to the way they had been. For months after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the unthinkable happened. The Varaxian hierarchy and the Keltharian Empire, two civilizations that had maintained a tense but stable peace for over 300 years, came within hours of declaring war on each other. The flashpoint was a disputed trade route through the Sigma sector, a region that both empires claimed had been promised to them in treaties signed decades ago. The argument itself was not new. The Varaxians and Keltharians had been disputing ownership of various border regions for as long as anyone could remember. What had changed was the absence of the person who had always prevented these disputes from escalating. For 20 years, human mediator Alex Turner had served as the unofficial referee between the two empires. He had an unusual talent for understanding both cultures and finding compromises that allowed each side to save face while avoiding conflict. Alex had spent countless hours in closed-door meetings, listening to grievances and explaining each side's perspective to the other. He had developed personal relationships with leaders on both sides, becoming someone they trusted even when they did not trust each other. When tensions rose, a simple call to Alex had been enough to start a dialogue. Now, Alex was back on Earth, and there was no one to fill the void he had left. The crisis began when a Keltharian merchant convoy entered the disputed sector and was fired upon by Varaxian patrol ships. 3 merchant vessels were destroyed before the convoy could retreat. The Keltharian Empire demanded immediate compensation and a formal apology. The Varaxian hierarchy claimed the merchants had been smuggling weapons and refused to apologize for defending their territory. Within hours, both sides were mobilizing military forces. The council attempted to intervene, but the mediation session quickly devolved into shouting and accusations. The Varaxian representative blamed the Keltharians for deliberately provoking conflict. The Keltharian representative accused the Varaxians of using the chaos caused by humanity's departure as cover for territorial expansion. Neither side was willing to back down, and there was no neutral party they both trusted to facilitate real negotiations. On the military front, the absence of Admiral Nina Rodriguez was creating disasters that made the trade route dispute look minor by comparison. Nina had spent 12 years building and coordinating the Council's peacekeeping fleet. She had developed the communication protocols that allowed ships from different species to work together effectively. She had trained officers from a dozen civilizations in joint operations and established the command structure that prevented confusion during crisis responses. Without her, the peacekeeping fleet was a collection of ships that could barely communicate with each other. When the Varaxian-Keltharian crisis erupted, the Council dispatched peacekeeping forces to 3 border sectors. The Zephron ships arrived at coordinates that put them 2 systems away from where they were needed. The Polarian contingent showed up 3 days late because they had been given the wrong departure time. The Varaxian and Keltharian ships that were supposed to be part of the peacekeeping force nearly fired on each other because their identification protocols were not synchronized. The situation would have been almost comical if lives were not at stake. Council officials watched in horror as their carefully maintained peacekeeping apparatus fell apart in real time. Orders were misunderstood. Reinforcements went to the wrong locations. Communication between different species, military units, broke down so completely that some ships resorted to using basic light signals to avoid collisions. In the scientific community, the consequences of humanity's departure were becoming equally apparent. The grand collaborative research initiative that had been the Council's pride and joy had collapsed entirely. The project had involved 7 species working together on advanced propulsion, technology that could revolutionize space travel. Each species had contributed their unique expertise to different aspects of the problem. The Varaxians understood energy field manipulation. The Keltharians were experts in exotic matter. The Zephrons had developed advanced mathematical models. Each piece was brilliant on its own. But physicist Daniel Brooks had been the only one who understood how all the pieces fit together. He had been the central coordinator, who translated between different scientific traditions and saw how seemingly unrelated discoveries could be combined into something greater than the sum of its parts. Without Daniel, the research teams discovered that they could not even understand each other's work. The Varaxian energy equations used mathematical frameworks that the Keltharians found incomprehensible. The Zephron models relied on concepts that did not exist in Varaxian physics. What had seemed like a unified project was actually 7 separate efforts that had been held together by one human who could speak all 7 scientific languages. The agricultural crisis that had begun in the previous month was now reaching catastrophic levels. Billions of beings across the galaxy were facing food shortages, while warehouses on agricultural worlds overflowed with crops that were rotting because no one knew where to send them. Hannah Price's distribution system had been far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. She had not just moved food from producers to consumers. She had managed a complex web of futures contracts, storage facility capacities, transportation logistics, and nutritional requirements that kept the entire galaxy fed, the Keltharian homeworld. A planet of 12 billion citizens was running out of the grain that formed the basis of their diet. Not because there was a shortage of grain in the galaxy, because the ships carrying that grain were currently unloading on a mining colony that had no use for it. Meanwhile, the mining colony was desperately waiting for a shipment of protein supplements that was sitting in a warehouse 3 systems away. The inefficiency was staggering, and people were starving because of bureaucratic failures rather than actual scarcity. Food became a weapon in the growing tensions between species. The Vraxians threatened to cut off agricultural exports to Keltharian worlds. The Keltharians responded by blocking shipments through their territory to Vraxian colonies. Species that had cooperated for decades were now hoarding resources and viewing their neighbors as threats rather than partners. The junior council members, who had spent centuries following the lead of the major powers, were now breaking ranks entirely. The Polarian Federation formally announced that they had signed a comprehensive trade and mutual defense agreement with Earth. The treaty was everything the Polarians had wanted but never received from the Council. Fair exchange rates, technology sharing, and military support in case of attack. Most importantly, treaty treated both sides as equal partners. Other small nations watched the Polarian announcement with great interest. Within days, 5 more species had requested similar negotiations with Earth. President Sofia Martinez welcomed each delegation personally, making it clear that humanity was interested in building relationships based on mutual respect. The meetings were conducted in comfortable conference rooms, rather than the imposing council chambers. The humans listened more than they talked. The agreements were negotiated rather than dictated. High Chancellor Thexler watched his power base crumbling in real time. The council that he had led for 20 years was fracturing along lines that had been invisible. When humanity provided the glue that held everything together, he called emergency meeting after emergency meeting, but nothing he proposed could stop the bleeding. His own people were beginning to question his leadership. Calls for his resignation were growing louder each day. The Varaxian military commanders were particularly angry. They had lost ships due to the peacekeeping fleet's incompetence. Their early warning systems were still producing false alerts. Their supply lines were breaking down due to the economic chaos. They blamed Thexler for driving away the humans. His expertise had kept everything running smoothly. In a closed session of the Varaxian High Command, generals who had served for decades discussed options that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Some suggested a military coup to replace Thexler with leadership that could swallow its pride and negotiate with Earth. Others proposed that Vracia should withdraw from the Council entirely and seek its own agreement with humanity. The discussion revealed how completely the Council's authority had deteriorated. On Earth, Ambassador Jack Morrison, now serving as Minister of Interspecies Relations, reviewed reports from across the galaxy with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The Council's collapse had happened faster than anyone predicted. The plan had been to apply economic and political pressure until the Council agreed to treat humanity with respect. Instead, the entire structure was coming apart, and there was a real risk of major wars breaking out. Jack met with President Martinez to discuss their options. They could continue watching the Council destroy itself, or they could take a more active role in building a new order. The President asked Jack a simple question. If they had the power to prevent suffering and chose not to use it, were they any better than the Council that had dismissed humanity's concerns for decades? Jack had no good answer to that question. The decision was made to accelerate the diplomatic outreach. Earth would offer technical assistance to any species willing to negotiate in good faith. Engineers would be sent to help stabilize the gate network. Medical teams would be dispatched to address the healthcare crisis, Agricultural experts would help restore the food distribution system. But all of this would be done through bilateral agreements, not through the Council. As the fourth month came to a close, the galaxy was in chaos. Wars threatened to break out in multiple sectors. Economies were in freefall. People were hungry and afraid. The old order that had maintained stability for centuries was gone, destroyed by its own arrogance. What would replace it was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity would play a central role in whatever came next, and this time they would do so as equals, rather than as second-class members of a club that had never wanted them in the first place. 6 months after, Ambassador Jack Morrison walked out of the Galactic Council chambers. High Chancellor Thexler stood in his private shuttle, heading toward Earth, and the weight of his failures sat heavy on his scaled shoulders. Behind him were 11 other council representatives, each one looking as uncomfortable as he felt. The delegation included leaders from the Varaxian hierarchy, the Keltharian Empire, the Zephron Collective, and every other major power that had spent decades treating humanity as inferior. The journey to Earth had been Thexler's last desperate move to hold on to power. Half the council members had already defected to negotiate independent agreements with humanity. The Gate Network was on the verge of complete failure. 3 separate wars were threatening to break out across the galaxy. His own government had given him an ultimatum: fix the situation or be removed from office. This delegation was his final chance. The shuttle approached Earth's orbital stations, and Nexler was struck by how much had changed in just 6 months. New construction was everywhere. Ships from a dozen different species were docked at human facilities. Species that had chosen to work with Earth rather than wait for the Council to solve problems it had created. The activity level was intense, purposeful, and stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that had consumed Council space. Earth's traffic control directed them to a landing pad at the diplomatic complex in Geneva. The facility was modest compared to the Grand Council chambers on Zenith Prime. There were no soaring domes or elevated platforms designed to make visitors feel small. Instead, they were greeted by Ambassador Jack Morrison standing at ground level, his hand extended in a gesture of welcome that somehow felt more powerful than any. Throne Jack led the delegation to a conference room with large windows overlooking the Alps. The room was comfortable, but not ostentatious. Everyone sat at the same level around a circular table. There were no hierarchies built into the furniture. Thexler noticed these details and understood the message being sent. This was not a negotiation between superior and inferior. This was a meeting of equals, or it was nothing at all. President Sofia Martinez entered the room and took her seat without ceremony. She thanked the delegation for coming and asked them to explain what they hoped to accomplish. The directness of her question caught several delegates off guard. They had prepared elaborate speeches about misunderstandings and unfortunate circumstances. Martinez was asking them to cut through the diplomatic language and state their real purpose. Thexler surprised himself and everyone else in the room by speaking honestly. He admitted that the Council had made terrible mistakes. He acknowledged that humanity had been treated unfairly for decades. He explained that the galaxy was falling apart without human expertise, and he asked what it would take for Earth to return to the galactic community. Martinez listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When Nexler finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she asked a question that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. She wanted to know if the Council's regret was based on genuine recognition of humanity's value, or if it was simply desperation caused by the consequences of their own arrogance. The question hung in the air like a challenge. The Keltharian representative started to offer a diplomatic non-answer, but Martinez raised her hand. She said that humanity had no interest in playing word games. If the Council wanted Earth's help, they needed to start by being honest about why they had come. It was the Zephron, Delegate Vexari, who broke the uncomfortable silence. His gaseous form swirled with colors that indicated shame and regret. He spoke about Commander Amy Sullivan, and how his people had never truly appreciated the sophistication of the defense network she had built. He admitted that the Zephrons had viewed human contributions as simple technical work rather than recognizing the strategic brilliance behind it. He said that his species had been wrong, and he was sorry. The apology opened a floodgate. One by one, the delegates spoke about the human experts whose departures had revealed how essential they had been. They talked about engineers and mediators and scientists and doctors. They described the systems that were failing and the suffering that had resulted. Some were more sincere than others, but all of them finally acknowledged what they had spent 6 months denying. The Council needed humanity far more than humanity needed the Council. Martinez listened to each confession and acknowledgement. When the last delegate had spoken, she explained Earth's position clearly and without anger. Humanity was willing to help the galaxy, but not by returning to a broken system. The Galactic Council had been built on hierarchies and assumptions of superiority that had led directly to the current crisis. If they wanted humanity's participation, they would need to build something new. Jack Morrison pulled up a holographic display showing the framework that Earth had been developing. It was called the Galactic Partnership, and its structure was radically different from the Council. All member species would have equal voting rights, regardless of when they joined or how powerful they were. Decisions would be made by consensus rather than by the dominant powers dictating terms. Technical expertise would be recognized and rewarded. Rather than taken for granted, the framework included provisions that made several delegates uncomfortable. Humanity would hold 3 permanent seats on all major committees in recognition of the expertise they brought to galactic infrastructure. Any species could request bilateral agreements outside the partnership framework. Member nations could leave at any time without penalty. The document was designed to prevent any single species or coalition from dominating the others. Dexler studied the proposal and realized it would end Viraxian dominance of galactic politics. The Keltharian representative saw the same thing. The old powers would have to share authority with species they had always considered beneath them. Several delegates began to object, starting to argue that such radical changes were unnecessary. Martinez cut them off with a simple statement. She said that Earth was not negotiating the fundamental principles of the partnership. These terms were non-negotiable. The delegates could accept them and work with humanity to build a better galactic community, or they could reject them and find their own solutions to the crises consuming their territories. But they could not have it both ways. They could not keep their privileged positions and expect humanity to save them from the consequences of their own failures. The room fell silent again as the delegates absorbed the ultimatum. They had come to Earth expecting to negotiate humanity's return to the existing order. Instead, they were being asked to dismantle that order and replace it with something that permanently changed the balance of galactic power. Some saw it as blackmail. Others saw it as justice. All of them understood that they had no real choice. The negotiations continued for 3 days. The details were argued and refined, but the core principles remained unchanged. On the 4th day, the Galactic Partnership Charter was signed by all 12 major powers, plus Earth. The old council would be dissolved. A new organization would be built on principles of equality and mutual respect. Humanity would return to galactic infrastructure work, this time as partners rather than servants. Engineer Lisa Chen was among the first to return to the Gate Network. She brought with her a team of human engineers and alien apprentices who were genuinely interested in learning rather than just taking over. Together, they began the slow work of repairing the damage and teaching others how to maintain the sophisticated systems that kept the galaxy connected. Commander Amy Sullivan returned to the Zephron Collective with a new agreement that gave her full authority over defense network operations. She also insisted on training programs that would eventually allow the Zephrons to manage their own security. The goal was not permanent human control, but genuine knowledge transfer that would leave every species capable of maintaining their own systems. Dr. Claire Bennett reopened the medical exchange program with expanded funding and new partnerships. The program would now include students from every species, training a generation of physicians who understood cross-species medicine and could work anywhere in the galaxy. On the trade world of Pelos, Merchant Captain Kevin Drake watched as human mediators returned to help resolve disputes and restore economic confidence. The process was slow, but within weeks the violence had stopped and trade was beginning to flow again. Kevin felt hope for the first time in months that his adopted home might return to the prosperity. He remembered Captain Ryan Hayes stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge. Back at his post near the restored Epsilon Gate, his crew was different now. Half the positions were filled by aliens who worked alongside humans as equals. They shared knowledge freely. They solved problems together. They had learned to respect each other not because anyone had demanded it, but because their survival depended on genuine cooperation. Ambassador Jack Morrison, now formerly the Minister of Interspecies Relations for the Galactic Partnership, addressed the first session of the new organization. The chamber was smaller than the old council hall, and everyone sat at the same level. He spoke briefly about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He talked about the pain of rejection and the vindication of being proven essential. He acknowledged the suffering that the transition had caused. Then he looked around the room at representatives from dozens of species and spoke the words that would define the new era. He said that the past 6 months had taught everyone an important lesson. No species, no matter how advanced or powerful, could thrive alone in a galaxy of such diversity. Strength came not from dominance, but from partnership. Progress came not from hierarchy, but from recognizing and valuing the unique contributions each civilization could make. He concluded with a simple promise. Humanity had returned not to restore the old order, but to help build something better. The Galactic Partnership would not be perfect, and there would be disagreements and difficulties ahead. But it would be built on a foundation of respect, and that made all the difference. Every species at the table had earned their place through their contributions, then inherited it through ancient privilege. Together, they would face whatever challenges the galaxy threw at them. As Jack sat down, he caught President Martinez's eye and saw her nod of approval. The galaxy had learned its lesson the hard way. Respect could not be demanded or assumed. It had to be earned through actions and maintained through integrity. Humanity had forced that lesson by walking away, and the galaxy was better for it. The day humanity left the Galactic Council, everything had collapsed. But from those ruins, something stronger and more just had emerged. And that was worth every difficult moment of the journey.